We're really excited to have you here today. Let's talk about why 2024 is Year of the GRC. I'm super pleased to introduce you to our speakers, Arik Solomon and Gavin Grounds. Let's talk about Gavin first. Gavin is the CEO and co-founder of Mercury Risk and Compliance. We're so grateful to have him here today. He's a seasoned professional in tech, cybersecurity, IT engineering and operations, and is a global thought leader in risk management and cybersecurity strategy. Hopefully today we'll hear a little bit more about his view on risk and specifically his grounds rules, which are very insightful, and I really recommend sticking around to hear them. We're also going to be speaking with Arik, who's our CEO and co-founder. Thank you, Fearless Leader, for being here. He has 20 years of executive experience in cybersecurity, consulting, and software development. And a few years ago, he founded Cypago, and we'll hear a little bit more about what Cypago is, and actually more specifically just about Cyber GRC and Cyber GRC Automation. So without further ado, let's hand it over to you, Arik.
Hey everyone, hey Tova, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with our great audience today. And it's also great to be with you here, Gavin. Let's see your pretty face.
Well, it's been described in some ways, Arik, but I'm not sure pretty face is necessarily one of the ones that comes to mind immediately. But nonetheless, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about our session today. It's going to be informative, hopefully, for the audience. I'm sure it will be, and also fun. So yeah, excited to be here with you.
Great, amazing. So I think that it's going to serve as a good backdrop to this discussion today. I mean, we call this session why 2024 is the year of the GRC, and we know that GRC has been around for so many years, but many interesting trends have been forming in the last, I would say, even months, and are taking place as we speak. And we see that all over us. We see data explodes and grows exponentially. We know that. Everybody that manages any aspect of data knows that. Data is everywhere. The federal authorities and all different types of authorities are heightening their and tightening up their scrutiny around security controls and different measures they would like the market or the industry to behave around the trends that we see. And again, these are the types of trends that we see all over us, all around us. Again, data complexity and the different changes or the multiple changes in the regulatory environment, and so on and so forth. And that brings about a lot of issues and difficulties. And I'm sure that, Gavin, you see that as well with the companies and people that you work with in the market. For me, the most important aspect, other than of course the inefficient workflows and the inability or the very limited ability to enforce security controls, but I think that one and foremost change that we have seen, started in 2023 actually, was the fact that now security leaders are personally liable for many of the processes that take place, and for them being able to actually provide an accurate overview of and status of what's going on security-wise in the company. And that's a significant change, and we already see that affecting so many different other processes. So I'm curious to know, Gavin, how you see that, how you see it, and what are the aftershocks for this kind of change?
Yeah, so I think maybe a couple of perspectives on that, Arik. As a global community of GRC professionals, whether we're in security, whether we're in risk, whether we're in governance, just looking at the slide that we're sharing here. When we look at those like little yellow arrows, we've seen data and the influx of regulations and processes and multi-cloud and so on. My observation is with the literally thousands of companies that I've worked with over the last 6 or 7 years in particular, Unfortunately, those little arrows that we represent on the diagram here are often humans. So if you think about like a typical GRC program, it's almost like a swivel chair activity to date for a lot of companies, you know. So it's like, oh, okay, so we have this issue over here, and then there's literally some human following up to say, did you solve that issue? Did you close that issue down? Or you know, it could be a non-compliance with even just a corporate objective. It could be related to compliance around our training programs or our onboarding programs. And there's still this human activity that goes on to say, did everybody that newly joined the company last month, did they take the mandatory training? So there are some degrees of, you know, automation there, but you know, Eric, as you shared this this view with me, I thought, you know, if I was to look at this and say, what is one of the fundamental weaknesses that we as a global community face right now, and that is how much of those little yellow arrows that all converge in the center of the screen right here, how much of those are based on a human being involved in the process. And yet on the left-hand side, when we think about like siloed data, you know, it's publicly knowable that, you know, for a lot of the organizations that I've supported over the last several years, you literally could be dealing with billions, literally, you know, 2 or 3 billion data elements in any 24-hour period. And somehow, as a community, as GRC professionals, whether we're in risk, whether we're in cybersecurity, whether in governance, compliance, it's almost like our processes and our delivery models are still built as though we're in the 1990s, and not in this environment where, whether it's a threat actor, whether it's regulatory compliance requirements, you know, citation requirements that we need to observe, all of the above is actually so much more automated than typically as a GRC community we are. So that was one of the things that really struck me as you know, when you first shared this, Eric, and therefore onto the right hand side, like lack of visibility, for example. We don't have a lack of data. We have a lack of insight as a community, because we've got the data, but we're not consuming the data in a fashion that gives us automated and meaningful insights. And then to your point about the personal liability, you know, obviously you know, we are seeing more and more of that, whether it's because of you know, some of the things that we've seen most recently that's happened in the United States around individual CISOs being held personally accountable for potential failures, whether it's a failure of disclosure or whether it's a failure to provide transparency. And then December 18th, of course, the new SEC regs came into law essentially around disclosure. And yet in the European Union with the European Commission, there's already been a huge foundation already built around privacy, around online safety. You know, you think about things like the DORA now that's becoming more, you know, more of an obligation essentially. You know, and I think part of the challenge, Eric, and I'm sure you're seeing the same thing, is sometimes as a GRC community we might fall into the trap of thinking that we need to be compliant with these regulatory objectives. In reality, when we think about it, most regulatory objectives are there to deal with the masses. So, for example, if we have a corporate contract, we will have a corporate agreement, one corporation to another corporation. As a consumer, ultimately, as consumers, we have to rely on regulators to be our voice to business, our voice to industry, our voice to providers. So these regulatory obligations, they are not simply a check in the box exercise that, oh yeah, we've got to be compliant with this under the European Commission, or we have to be compliant with this now under SEC regulations. Those are there to actually provide, to make sure that as businesses we're providing the right kind of protection to individual consumers, of which there are, you know, arguably 7 billion or so on the planet. So I know that's kind of a lot of info download, but that is kind of what I'm seeing, is that, you know, the the challenges that you've highlighted, Arik, on this slide here on the right-hand side are fed by the fact on the left-hand side there is so much automation. There is such a plethora of that on the left-hand side, and we're relying almost exclusively, not always, almost exclusively, on those little yellow arrows to be humans to kind of do that connection to everything that's on the challenges on the right-hand side.
Exactly, I totally agree with that. And due to the fact that humans are always the weakest link, although we are doing our best and we are trying to leverage the tools that we have at hand, I think that the reality is that the effects or the trends that we just discussed do have some significant impact on businesses almost everywhere. And when we look at that, and it's very obvious. I mean, think about the fact, I mean, you just mentioned, there's, I mean, billions of data points, and we have the data, right? But what we don't have, as you just phrased it, we don't have the insights. What does it mean? It means that the share of the unknowns just keeps growing. So we're the part that is still in the dark for us as security leaders, as leaders in any organization, because it doesn't really matter. Yes, it's the CISO's role, but it's CEOs and the other executive team responsibility for the entire for their customers' data, for their customers' trust, etc. So this is a super significant impact. There are several other ways in which organizations kind of suffer due to the complexity and the effects that, again, we just discussed. I think it's one other that is worth mentioning, and I just used this word, trust. Everybody talks about trust, right? What trust is all about? Well, different people will provide different definitions for that, but simply put, when you are being open and honest and you're sharing all the data that you have with the relevant parties, this is where you gain trust, because the other side interacting with you trusts the fact that whatever you provide them reflects the actual reality. I think things slowly or can slowly deteriorate when you think about it. CISOs report to the board. They take the data that they have, either as a result of a risk management exercise or a daily security control implementation exercise. But the last time that they did that was a quarter ago. And now they go with 3-month-old data to the executive team in order to brief them in on how the company is doing. How relevant is this? Okay, what are the risks embedded in the fact that you are using point-in-time data in order to communicate that with upper management? So I think these are some of the impacts that I see. Again, you mentioned some of them just now, but please do. I mean, expand on that. It's interesting to see how you see that from the risk management perspective.
It's really some good points, Arik. I think just touching on some of the points that you just raised, I think, again, as a community, collectively, when I say we, I don't necessarily mean you and I mean, you know, collectively as a community, I think there's almost an irony in the fact that if you look at whether it's an ISO-based model, whether you're looking for your certification around ISO 27000 series or whatever, there's this annual event that happens, and the annual event for most companies looks like you get, like, 15 or 20 representatives in a room, and you talk about what you imagine the 10 or 15 top risks are to your company. And I use the word imagine very deliberately, because there's been, like I say, I've had the privilege and opportunity to provide services to thousands of companies. And what's interesting is, like, with one or two of those engagements that come to mind, I'd get into those meetings and they'd talk about scenarios about this thing, and this might happen, and this would be the result, and so on. So I would ask the question and say, oh, wow, geez, that's crazy. Has that ever happened? And like, no, no, no. We just, we just think that's a feasible scenario. So for multiple reasons, it becomes apparent why that is an ineffective approach. And by the way, just for the audience here, Eric and I, we're not going to spend the rest of the day just lamenting how problematic this is. We do have some, hopefully, we can share some insights with you all that will help kind of go beyond the problem statement and get into a go forward approach. But the challenge, I just call that a worry list. It's like, okay, so you've created a list of things that you're worried about that may or may not ever transpire. But at least you get the checkbox in your ISO 27000 series. Like, yeah, okay, we have our 15. In fact, there was one certifier for one particular company, whom will remain nameless for this conversation. And his response was, "That's a pretty short list." I was like, okay, well, how big should the list be? Like, I don't know, bigger than that. So much subjectivity. But to your point, Eric, even if those air quotes risk assessments were done based on some semblance of facts and data, from the day you start collecting those facts and data, assuming that there are hard facts and data sitting behind some of that worry list, by the time you finish compiling that report, it's already 3 months out of date, give or take. And by the time it gets communicated, whether it's to the board or whether it's to the C-suite or whether it's to operational leaders, it's already out of date. And then you revisit it maybe 1 quarter later, maybe half a year later, maybe a year later. And so really it becomes at least in my observation, a futile exercise, futile use of resources to essentially check the box and say we did a risk assessment, as opposed to the risk assessment being like in any other domain of risk, we are trying to monitor risk in as near real time as possible. I used to do motor racing, and I didn't do a risk assessment at the beginning of the season and then forget about it for the rest of the season. My risk assessments and my judgments were being made in almost nanosecond timing, based on everything that was going on around me. And I think in the particularly in cyber GRC, I think we've lost sight of C is compliance, and that can be calendar based and cyclical, rather not circular, cyclical. But the R in GRC, we have to drive it to be as near real time as possible. Else otherwise, we're not doing risk management. What we're doing in the name of risk is actually a compliance function. Did we do a risk assessment? Yes, we did. Okay, we're compliant. We didn't really do risk assessment. So pretty a longer-winded Eric, but that's kind of how I see as a community we've kind of gravitated typically today.
I think becoming or taking or transforming cybersecurity in general to be relevant, up to date, and be used as kind of a guiding map rather than an obligation that I have to, as you said, just check the box. I think this is the transition that we are talking about today. I think that before we move on, Tova, I think that we can we have a couple of questions to share with the audience here today.
Yeah, we'd love to get the audience's insights on some more of these topics. So let's have a quick poll. Everyone will get some water maybe. Let's talk a little bit about Cyber GRC. Attendees, does your organization have a Cyber GRC strategy in place? We'd love to hear your answers. So we'll wait a few seconds. By the way, I think while we're waiting, this is a really good time to transition over to Gavin, your thoughts about risk. What do you think?
It's going to be a risk to ask Gavin about risk.
Okay, we'll wait another 30 seconds. I know there's a bit of a delay. Okay, thank you everyone for answering. Let's move on.
All right. So I hate over. I realized I was talking on mute during that time, which is probably a good thing. It gives the audience a little bit of time to think about the question. And I don't know if you.
Let me ask you to hold this thought for a second. I don't know, Tova, if we have the data that the slide with some numbers that we wanted to share. Do you have it?
Yeah, 1 second.
Before we jump into the the remedies, the answers to the concerns that we've just discussed, I think it's important to realize what are we looking at, what's coming up next. And we've kind of assembled or gathered data from multiple sources, Gartner and other relevant, highly relevant sources, and we've discussed that. But it's important to see that I just want to dwell on just one, and that's the middle piece here that talks about the fact that by 2026, most of the boards will have a cyber experts serving and guiding them around cybersecurity. And that's for everybody that knows how boards function today. That's going to be I don't know, an earthquake, not less than that, a tremendous change, because right now CISOs, they have the liberty to come into a board meeting and say pretty much whatever they want, minus, of course, the liability or the accountability, and that's a significant factor. But other than that, most of the people around the table will not have the tools to realize or to appreciate the risks they share, the mitigation. Are the mitigations relevant? Have they been analyzing the company in the right way, etc., etc. The fact that upper management and C-suite will have cyber experts, or at least people that know and will have the tools to analyze that, will pretty much kind of set the stage in dramatically, okay, in a different manner. And again, Gavin, you kind of touched upon that just now when you said these are the risks that we imagine. Now, if you have someone that actually knows what cyber is all about, it will be a little bit difficult to imagine risks that are not relevant, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in response to that, Arik and Tova, this will kind of cover off a little bit of your question earlier as well about the the perspective on risk. I think again, as a community, we whether we're a CISO or we're involved in some aspects of GRC, I think the language that we use around risk is still very, very confusing. So as an example, we might say, well, we have actually, by the way, we should have done like a little bit of a warning. If you or any of your loved ones have ever been involved in a motorcycle accident, we should have given you that little warning. But this is a true story, actually. This is my brother Darren. So I mentioned earlier that I had a lot of motorsports. So did my brother, and so does my brother. So some of these are stock photos, and some of them are actual him. So that's him on the right-hand side at the bottom left. So to be clear, he survived this. But when we think about the way we talk about risk, as a community, we speak about it very inconsistently. So I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting one time with a group of, amongst others, lawyers, and one of the comments that they made is, well, that increases the risk. And my response back was, no, it doesn't increase the risk. It changes the likelihood. And so sometimes we, even from a vernacular perspective, we confuse the terminology. That likelihood is risk, and it's not. So one of the things that as the model, and AVRQ, probably you referred to earlier about ground rules. I didn't adopt that, by the way. I'm not a kleptomaniac. That was a play on words by, I think, probably Gartner actually, that joked about it, saying, "Oh, it's ground rules," as in playing on my name. It's kind of cool. I'll take it. But nonetheless, it's not just an algorithm for trying to calculate risk or loss avoidance. It's really about like standardizing on the way we use the vernacular in the first place. So what I often encourage is if you have a risk statement, whether it's in your ISO 27000 or whatever it is, if you have a risk statement, replace the word risk with consequence or potential consequence. And does the statement still make sense? And if it doesn't, then it's not a risk statement, it's just a statement. So for example, we say, well, that increases the risk. What we might really be saying is that increases the likelihood. But the risk is still the risk. So in the graphic earlier, my brother did have that accident. And the risk, the potential consequence was that he would have lost his life. He basically fractured his skull completely around, so his skull was fractured, so the top half from the bottom half of his skull. He broke every bone in his face. He had a compound fracture in his leg. His thigh bone was sticking out, and he was bleeding out internally and externally. He had ribs and everything else. So the potential consequence was his life. Now, he could have exercised a control. He could have put a control in place that would reduce his speed. That would be a control. That would have changed the likelihood of the accident. But if he still had the accident, the potential consequence was still the potential loss of his life. So by exercising that control of reducing his speed, that would have only impacted likelihood, not changed the consequence. Now, he could have had another control in place, which that day, unfortunately, he did not. He could have worn a crash helmet. The crash helmet would not have changed the likelihood of the accident, but it would have changed the potential consequence that you might not have then got a fractured skull. And so when we think about that in the context of any risk model, I think it's really important that we understand which controls impact or change likelihood and which controls can literally exchange consequence. So maybe the consequence doesn't become death, the consequence becomes 3 weeks in intensive care, not 8 weeks in intensive care. So controls can exchange the consequence, and controls can dilute likelihood, but risk is not equivalent to likelihood. So Toby, you can move to the next slide if
Okay.
you want. So we've seen this whole common view that says risk is likelihood times impact, and really why I wanted to show that true story about my brother and his motorcycle racing days is that if we say that risk is actually a potential consequence, then likelihood does not dilute that potential consequence. It literally just changes the likelihood of that consequence materializing, but we can exchange the consequence. So, for example, put that into a cyber perspective, there is therefore no such thing as data loss risk. There's no such thing. Data loss is an outcome. It's not the risk, it's the outcome. The risk is the potential consequence of that resulting state. So data loss is a resulting state. It in itself is not the risk. 2 examples. You might have a database of 100,000 records, and you have another database of 100 records. And this 100,000 records contains PII, personally identifiable information. And we've seen enough of these examples, unfortunately, in recent history, where that 100,000 records gets, exposed. So we might look at that and say, wow, that's 100,000 records of PII. So when we see some of these calculations and say, the average value of a loss per record, I actually don't put a lot of stock in that, and here's why. So yes, 100,000 PIIs, maybe we have to do now some reparations to those individuals, and there's a cost associated with that. But this database with 100 records, what if those 100 records contain all of the configuration parameters for the cellular network routing of all of the north of the United States? So the actual potential consequence of that 100 records is actually much more significant than the potential consequence of that 100,000 records. So that's why I think it's really important as part of the community to, and by the way, what I'm showing you here mathematically on the slide is if you were to literally try to say risk, therefore potential consequence, is likelihood multiplied by impact, you can see that we have so many different denominators that the algorithm at the bottom is what that risk equals likelihood times impact would look like. If anyone on this call can solve that algorithm, drop me a line and I will buy you dinner.
You can do this on the fly if you want to. Yeah.
Or answer on the fly, yeah.
No, but it's interesting because what the consequence is actually the impact to the business. I mean, there's the result. I mean, what happened? The records were leaked, but the interesting question is what happened to the business? In the examples that you just shared, there's a difference, significant difference between an amount of records holding PII data and something that holds the entire North American cellular network configuration data. The impact of the business, this is where things become much more interesting, and therefore the calculation that you suggest here makes more sense.
Yeah, and by the way, just for clarification, in that example that you gave, Arik, I'll just be super clear. I was not referring to the service outage that AT&T had like a few days ago in Northeast America. So please, anyone listening, don't make that connection because I'm literally not. I have no.
Example. Random example.
Yeah. On the left-hand side, the other thing that I wanted to point out is the equation on the left-hand side. You know, some of you might have recognized that immediately to be the Euler-Lagrange equation. If you're not familiar with it, I'll just break it down simply. What the Euler-Lagrange equation does is it mathematically establishes the shortest, most efficient route from point A to point B. Now, we might think that that should just be a straight line. Well, if you work for a company that does maps or routing algorithms and so on, you realize that there are all kinds of things that get in the way. It could be traffic, it can be whether roads exist versus whether roads don't exist. It could be a mountain range that's in the way. So what the Euler-Lagrange equation does is it calculates the optimal route to get from point A to point B. And so when we think about that from a risk perspective, and this is a really important foundation of the air quotes grounds rules. It's not, this part is not an equation, it's a principle. And one of the principles is our job as risk management professionals is not to reduce risk. Our job is to advise on how to optimize risk. Now, for those of you that are from a business background, or if you have your MBAs, I'll put it in this type of language. When we think about what the board really wants to hear, what they're looking for typically is they want to understand, is the executive leadership of the company managing the company in the best possible way for the shareholders? And if we're for a not-for-profit or a government organization, still the same principle. We want to know how well are we managing our budgets. So the magic word is return, not reduction. So what the board are looking for is a return on equity, a return on investment, a return on cash, and equally a return on risk. So the average board members, they are not looking for, ROR does not stand for reduction of risk. ROR stands for return on risk, in the same way as return on equity, return on investment, return on capital, return on cash. So what the board is looking for in every other risk domain is a return on risk. And so what we as cybersecurity professionals and cyber GRC professionals is we want to provide that return on risk. In other words, our job is not to reduce risk. Our job is to help the leadership to optimize risk. In other words, help inform what risks we should take. Now, let me give a very practical example. During, I think all of us probably had the experience of living through the Log4j air quotes crisis. But if you think what happened there, Log4j for most companies was actually a potential problem. is really what it was. But most companies redirected a boatload of engineering time away from whatever those engineers were working on to address Log4j. Go find where it is, get it out of here, update the libraries, recompile code, promote to production. And so whatever those engineers were working on before, because we didn't magically get new engineers out of the sky, we had to repurpose existing resources. Now, what that meant from a financial perspective, by the way, and therefore from a business risk management perspective, is that by us redirecting those engineering resources, we literally, as a community, we diluted the net present value of every business initiative that those engineers were otherwise working on. And that's the best case. We diluted the net present value. In the worst case, we might have missed a first mover opportunity in some other program because we redirected those engineers to deal with a potential problem of Log4j at the time. And so I think that's a really tangible example of that. Wasn't risk management, that was the worry list. It's like, oh my goodness, Log4j, so let's worry about that. And we literally diluted, we're saying we, not me and Arik, but we as a community diluted the net present value of a lot of our businesses because we weren't dealing with actual risk, we were dealing with a worry list. Arik, you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I do have a thought, and also the clock has its own habit of running too fast when we're just starting to have some fun. Maybe Tova, before we move on, we have another question that we would like to share with the audience today.
I think we're a little short on time. Why don't we move into a little bit more about the solution, about this holistic view.
Great. I think so we already established what we believe can be a significant change or improvement in the way that organizations manage the risks, or the cyber risk, more to speak. But I think there's another important aspect, and that's kind of taking a step back and looking at the entire value chain of cyber GRC and taking it from the holistic perspective. And that means that you go through all the important stages as depicted here on this slide. When you start off with the policies and procedures and processes internal for the organization, specific, that were developed in-house, that match the specific requirements and needs of the organization. Now, the second step would be to embrace or implement kind of off-the-shelf known frameworks that are that serve as a good basis to structure or to design a security program around. The third, or the next phase, the next step in the process would then be, again, to calculate the risks and do that on an ongoing basis, as we described earlier. And you want to make sure that you reduce, again, the likelihood, or you mitigate the consequences by implementing the relevant security controls. Otherwise, you don't have that. I mean, this is the incentive to go in and implement these controls. And again, once you implement them, once you know how to collect and analyze and measure the data that you have all across your infrastructure, in the cloud, on premises, SaaS tools, whatever you have, you now get or face the findings, because you have the risk, you have the controls, you have the data. Put all those together and you get the findings, which are in many cases the gaps that you need to somehow go around or mitigate or find other means in order to fill in these gaps. And then you go back to the policies and procedures, because you want to make sure that all these procedures that you defined in the first place are still in place and nothing has changed. For example, your password policy, you have what you believe in, and now once you went through all this cycle, you come back to the policy, and you want to make sure that it's still it is still relevant. And if not, you need to implement some changes to that, and then again see if there are any changes have been made to the frameworks that you implemented, or you want to take on additional ones because you just started selling into the healthcare market, and now you need to be aligned with HIPAA or high trust, or again, the list goes on, and the cycle goes on. So this is the way that we've seen super successful, being implemented super successfully with so many of the leading organizations out there that understand the notion of continuous control monitoring and the need to be on top of the status, not just once a year or twice a year, but do that on a regular basis, measuring the data, being able to quantify it, and then going through the optimization process, being from the risk perspective or the actual controls and finding mitigation perspective.
Yeah, and hey, Eric, one of the things you and I talked about previously, I think it's worth just kind of sharing with the audience as well, is when we get to like stages 4 and 5 in particular on this chart here, is it may be that a control that used to be relevant to our business is no longer relevant to our business. So it's not only about testing our efficacy of how we are operating against the control framework or frameworks in a multi environment, but also identifying through this whole automated process, identifying controls that actually make no more sense anymore. And again, very, very short story. It used to be a law in London that taxi drivers had to have a bale of hay in the boot of the vehicle. The boot is the trunk for the American audience, and that law was there in the interest of animal safety, because in the day taxis were all horse drawn. But of course, you wind the clock forward to the 20th century, and there are very few taxis that are horse-drawn anymore. So there's an example of a control or a law that then needed to be kicked out because it was no longer relevant. So I thought, Eric, it's just worth pointing that out to the audience as well, that it's not just about tightening up our operations to meet control objectives. This process also allows us to look at controls and say, is this still relevant to this particular business? We might have divested of a certain business, or we might have pulled out a particular geography, and that's going to change therefore our requirements. So we don't have to arbitrarily meet control objectives that frankly are irrelevant. So Eric, that was just worth pointing out from mine and your conversations earlier as well.
Okay, great. Now, I'm sure that we could have continued this discussion for hours now, and that's been amazing. I don't know if you noticed, but 45 minutes just passed by like in a breeze. But in the sake of time and allowing our audience to go back to their lunches, I think that this is a very good point to put a point to this discussion. Tova, we are now ready to wrap up, so feel free to take the lead.
Okay, thanks. Hold on one second. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And Gavin, thank you again for being a guest. And I could tell we really only touched the surface of all of these topics. We really need to get together again and do another in-depth webinar about more of these issues regarding risk and value propositions and numbers. I think it would be really fascinating, and we obviously don't have time today. Quickly, before we go to questions and answers, I just wanted to let everyone know that we offer solutions to some of these problems. Here's just a little bit: continuous control monitoring, complete coverage, intelligent automation. Arik can feel free to expand upon those. Feel free to scan the code if you want to learn a little bit more. And same here for Gavin. I don't know if each of you want to expand on that a little bit.
I think the next time we need to allocate a full day in order to have a distant discussion, right?
Well, I actually, well, how about we put this out there, Eric, for any of the audience that are interested, we can arrange some specific workshops without charge, and not sales pitch at all, from either Cypago, and thank you Cypago, Eric, and team for sponsoring today's event. But yeah, this is definitely not intended to try and sell products, but also to educate. So we can put that out there. We can do a couple of online workshops. I think that'd be awesome. Yeah, and thank you for hosting me as well. And I always say I'll try to make my story shorter, but you know, being born of Irish blood, it's difficult for me to tell short stories. It's just the way it is.
Well, the point of telling a story is telling it, so that's perfectly fine. Thank you, Gavin. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully, we'll have another one sometime soon. Thank you, Tova, and thank you, everyone, for attending today. See you next time.
Yeah, and thank you for your questions. Sorry we don't have time to address them live. We'll get back to each of you personally. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.